Let's talk about AWS API Gateway. This is the final service in the serverless architectural components. And AWS API Gateway will stitch the front end with the backend Lambda function. So before going into AWS API Gateway, let me discuss about a few components. First of all, what is an API? So API is an application programming interface. So suppose I have written a program which provides some functionality. For example, the Lambda function which you had written and which you had executed, that function will get us some data from a database. So you cannot query the database directly. You need to use the program or the Lambda function which you had written earlier. So that function or that program provides a functionality or a feature to get data from a database. Now, suppose there's one more program which wants to use or get the same data or some other data from the same database. So instead of writing another code by that program should call the Lambda function or the code which you have written, and that should fetch the data from the database and give it back to the calling program or main calling program. Let's say we have program A, which is calling program B, and program B is the Lambda function, not function in basic, not function, a Python program with some web framework. That program goes and gets the data from Aurora serverless database, MySQL database. Now program A wants to get the same sort of data, but there are other features also or which has to be provided by program A. Now to get the data from the database, program A has to call program B, and program B will have fetch the data and give it back to program A. Now program B, as I said, is a program which you have written in Lambda, but it will not be in Lambda, it's in Python Flask web framework. Now, how program A accesses or calls program B? Now, if you are familiar with web services, then the program B has to be created as a web service, and that web service will expose something called an API or application programming interface. Using that interface, program A would call program B. So that is an API. Let me give you an example. This is a very basic Python program with Flask web framework. So Flask is a web framework used for Python. Now this is actually a web service. Now what it says is forget about everything. So I'm importing Flask. The web framework, and I'm initializing the Flask program here, and this is what I'm saying is that whenever the route or the root of your URI ends with /API program, then this function should be executed. And this function is returning a very basic text message. Now I could have defined other things also, but at the end, of what I'm saying is I'm executing the program on port 8080. So this program is actually exposing this API, exposing this functionality which is written in this function API program via this interface or via this endpoint /API-program. So whenever I use this endpoint, it should give me the functionality of this one of whatever is written inside of this function API program. Let us go ahead and try to run this program. First of all, I'll run API program, and it's saying that it is being run on HTTP 127.0.0.1:8080. Let us try to go and get this program. Now if I type this 127.0.0.1/8080, it will not be executed because I have not exposed any API in this root, in the main root. Where I have exposed is here, API-program. It should tell me this is to demonstrate API. So I'm getting this functionality. If I want, I can add another functionality also. Let us go ahead and do that. All right, I have added one more function or functionality on the route or on the path /tetra serverless, and the API name is tetra. I have added one more API slash tetra serverless, and the name of the function is tetra. So basically, the functionality of this method or of this function is exposed by this endpoint, which is slash tetra serverless. It is nothing, it is just a variable. I have defined a variable and I'm returning that variable in JSON format. Now if I add slash tetra serverless, I should be able to see this output, which will show name as Tetranodal, class as AWS Serverless Architecture, and the services used is in an array S3 API Gateway, Lambda, and Aurora Serverless. So this is another API. Let us go ahead and try that. And this is the previous one, API program. Now if I remove this and if I try Tetra Serverless, it should give me the output class AWS Serverless Architecture, services used, and name is Tetranodal. So another functionality. Now, if let's say another program wants to use this particular functionality, they have to use this endpoint. I'll show you the same thing using Postman. So Postman is very useful to be used as a REST client. Think of Postman as another program which is trying to access the functionality of this program which I've just written. Okay, so this is Postman. Now what I'm trying to do here is I'll try to get data uh, from the endpoint or from the API which you have just defined. So it's a GET request. I'll enter the URL and the endpoint is Tetra Serverless. Now I should get an output of what I have seen so far. So if I press send, I'm getting this output. So this is being replied by the Python program which you have just written. That is nothing but a RESTful web service, and it has two APIs. One is slash tetra serverless and the other one is API hyphen program. If I send, it is saying this is to demonstrate API. I'm getting the same output. So this is what API is. Now if you see here, I have defined two methods, right, to get two APIs. There can be thousands of APIs in your program or in your application. So in that case, you might have to write thousands of methods or maybe different programs in thousands of methods, and you have to keep on running this program. But in our case, we are not using this functionality or this web service or this Flask web framework at all. We are using Lambda function. The reason is we have API gateway. Now you know what API is. So what is an API gateway? API gateway is actually what it says. It's a gateway to the APIs. Now the APIs are being provided by Lambda functions. So we have not used any program, we have not used any route as such, we have not used any web framework. We're using the Lambda function to define our APIs. It's nothing, right? API is nothing but a functionality which has to be exposed using an endpoint. Now we'll have to define the endpoint in API gateway, but when we define that, we attach our Lambda function with the API gateway endpoint. Now think of it this way. Suppose this is the endpoint which we want. We'll not be defining any single program or multiple programs, but we want, again, suppose we want this API slash API hyphen program. So if we don't use Lambda, we'll have to define a program, we have to write a program and run the web framework. For Python, it is Flask. But in our case, what we'll do is we'll define this endpoint or this API endpoint in API gateway. And whatever functionality is provided by this piece of code would be provided by Lambda. Same is the case here also. So the API endpoint is slash tetra serverless, and whenever this API is called, it returns this. But instead of writing it in a program, we'll define this endpoint in the API gateway, and this piece of code or this functionality will be provided by another Lambda function. So for each API, we need to have one Lambda function. So it makes a coding much easier because you have one-to-one mapping with your API and your code. So you know which Lambda function is getting executed and which Lambda functions are not getting executed. Now there's one more advantage also. Think of it this way. Suppose this API is being used a lot of times, but not this one. Suppose for every 100 execution of slash API-program API, slash tetra serverless gets executed only 10 times. So it's 1:10 ratio. So if you use the same program, this program itself have to be scaled for API program, which includes tetra serverless also. But if you use Lambda function, only we'll have one Lambda function for this API, which is slash API-program, and only that function will scale out. This function will only execute 10 times, and this function will execute 100 times. So these are mutually exclusive. There's no dependency between multiple APIs. So that's why using serverless component, basically using AWS Lambda and API gateway, using in the serverless architecture, make things much easier than writing a code by itself, right, for the APIs.